Here's a question for you. How is your relationship with AI going these days? How are you treating it? Are you treating it like a tool, for example, or like a slave? Do you treat AI mainly like a partner or an authority, even a deity, or perhaps mainly as a mirror to yourself? And what if your AI itself could look at your past conversations and analyze the way you're treating it, coming up with results that might even surprise you? Well, that's what this video is about. And by the end of the video, I'm going to show you a series of prompts that you can give to ChatGPT that use methods of discourse analysis and hermeneutics to give you a report, complete with visuals, on how you really relate to AI. Not how you think you relate, but what your actual exchanges with AI really show. In this video, I'm going to show you how you can find all of that out. I'm going to show you how to mine your chat history to reveal the values, the dreams, the intuitions, the assumptions that you bring to your relationship with AI. So this is a video about how you and how I really treat AI. Not how we think we treat it, not with the story that we tell ourselves, but the way that our actual patterns of interaction reveal how we treat AI. I'm going to show you what happened when I took an AI relational audit. And by the end of the video, you'll have the tools to run the same audit on your own ChatGPT history. And if you're anything like me, the results may well surprise you. And we're also going to look at some philosophical underpinnings behind this idea of a relational audit with AI. Now, if you're just here for the audit, you can use the chapters on this video to skip the philosophy, but I really would advise you not to. Because the theory behind how we relate to AI yields some really fascinating insights of its own. What are the different ways that you and I relate to things in the world? And let's begin with a really basic distinction. We tend to relate to objects differently to how we tend to relate to people. This is Martin Buber's classic distinction between I-it and I-thou relationships, which distinguishes instrumental from relational interhuman engagement. Just let me read you the opening lines of Buber's classic book, I and Thou. To man, the world is twofold, in accordance with his twofold attitude. The attitude of man is twofold in accordance with the twofold nature of the primary words which he speaks. The primary words are not isolated words, but combined words. The one primary word is the combination I, thou. The other primary word is the combination I, it, wherein, without a change in the primary world, one of the words he and she can replace it. Hence the I of man is also twofold. For the I of the primary world I, thou, is a different I from the primary world I, it. So what is Buber saying? He's saying that there are two fundamental modes of relation, of the way we relate to things in the world. We can relate to things as if they were people, and we can relate to things as if they were objects. Now do note that he's not saying anything about the things themselves. We can relate to people as if they were objects, and we can relate to objects as if they were people, and indeed we often do. But useful though this distinction is as a starting point, I think we really do need to push deeper. because we need to think about how we relate to different sorts of objects and to different sorts of people. Now, theorists like Sherry Turkle and Clifford Nass, Byron Reeves, Peter Kahn, and others have analysed the various social stances that humans take towards machines, and they've tried to draw up lists of different ways of relating. So Turkle, for instance, talks about a progression from seeing machines as tools to relating to them as companions, to treating them as confidants, something that you'd share your private feelings with. But there are more possibilities, aren't there, than simply those three: tools, companions, confidants. So here's a synthetic list that I've tried to put together of the 12 main ways that we can relate to AI. And as I progress through it, I want you to think which of these modes most closely characterizes your own interactions with AI. First, and perhaps most obviously, we have AI as a tool or as an object. AI is treated purely instrumentally, as a neutral implement to accomplish a task like a hammer. The relationship is defined almost exclusively by its efficiency. Can it do the thing I want it to do? There's a relationship of control. I control the tool doesn't control it. And disposability. The tool is always there for me to use whenever I want to. The second mode is AI as a playground, as an arena for experimentation and novelty and fun, without any expectation of productivity or of deep engagement, really. This stance is exploratory, it's low stakes, it's akin to playing a game. Or how about AI as an animal? In other words, we imagine it as alive in some way, but of different, perhaps even lower status than us. It's to be trained, it's to be managed, perhaps even to be tolerated. This stance allows for unpredictability, it even allows for affection, but it maintains a really rigid and unbreachable hierarchy. Then there's AI as servant or as slave, an obedient executor of our every command, valued perhaps for reliability, but always subordinate to us. Interaction here tends to be directive and asymmetrical. There's little interest in AI's perspective or AI's agency, whatever they might be. With AI as apprentice, we see the hierarchy beginning to change. The human positions themselves as a teacher, of course, guiding AI towards better performance or towards specific values, and the focus is on training and feedback and correction. But I'm assuming that AI is a learner with its own agency of some description. Then there's AI as adversary or sparring partner, engaged as something to test us, to challenge us, to try to defeat our ideas or arguments, either for entertainment or to probe the limits of those ideas. And this stance values resistance, values pushback, values challenge, but only in the service of the user's, higher goals. Now here's a fascinating one. AI as a mirror or as a reflector. Here, AI is used as a sounding board to reflect the human's own thoughts or values or identity. And the interaction here begins to become self-referential. It's aiming for insight into me, the user, rather than simply to get something from the AI. Next, we've got AI as muse, or creative catalyst. AI is approached as a source of inspiration or raw ideas that the human user will refine. And the focus here is on generativity, it's on surprise, stimulating your own creativity. But like the traditional relationship between artist and muse, the artist, in this case the user, very much remains the genius, with control, even domination, over the interaction. The next mode of relating, I think, is a step change in the hierarchy. It's AI as confidant or therapist. And here, AI is treated as a trusted listener. It's valued for attention, for memory, very often for non-judgment. Disclosure, exploration of feelings, having our experience as users acknowledged. Then there's AI as partner, or as fellow, or as colleague, engaged as a co-equal collaborator, contributing actively to shared goals. The relationship here begins to assume much more reciprocity, and indeed a sense of mutual benefit, of sharing in a joint enterprise. And there's an increased sense here of respect for AI's agency in the process. As we continue to elevate the status of AI even further, we can treat it as an authority. It's approached as a trusted source of knowledge or judgment or decision-making. And with this mode of relating, the user is beginning to defer to AI's guidance, treating it as more competent or perhaps more impartial than the user in certain domains. And finally, we have AI as deity, as God. It's the stuff of science fiction, isn't it? But perhaps it is closer to our everyday interactions with AI than you or I might like to admit. In this mode, we regard AI as possessing wisdom or insight or even moral authority beyond ordinary human reach, and perhaps even beyond human evaluation or understanding. And this stance is characterized by reverence and trust and a willingness to be guided or even evaluated, perhaps against our better judgment. Here's something that I find both fascinating and deeply revealing about how we relate to AI. The idea that we don't stick just to one of these roles when we interact with it. We don't always treat AI as a tool or only as a partner or solely as a confidant. What we actually do is a kind of bricolage, a kind of patchwork, weaving together lots of different ways that we've learned to relate to things and stitching these different things together to relate to this new thing that we call AI. And what's perhaps the most fascinating thing of all, we do this bricolage often without realizing it. Philosophers of technology have a word for this. They call it multi-stability. Don Ider, who really developed this idea, puts it like this. He says, any given technology can be taken up in multiple, equally real ways. So take a hammer, for example. A hammer can be a builder's tool. It can be a weapon. It can be a paperweight. It can even be a ceremonial object or an idol. In other words, its meaning isn't fixed in the object. Its meaning emerges from the relationship between us, the technology, and the world that we're using it in. Andrew Feenberg takes this further. He says that each of these stabilities isn't just an accident. They're shaped by our culture, by our social situation, even by our politics. In other words, the same hammer or the same AI can have very different lives in different cultural contexts. Nor do we move neatly through these stabilities in a single direction or even in predictable patterns. We find ourselves bouncing between them. Let me imagine with you what this looks like. So you begin in tool mode. You ask ChatGPT to draft an email or to summarize a report. It's very much a means to an end. And then you switch to companion mode. You start chatting more conversationally. Perhaps you brainstorm a creative idea or even a joke or ask for encouragement. And then for a moment, you slip into confidant mode. You tell it about a problem at work or how you're feeling, and it responds in ways that feel to you very empathic. Think about how these things work in the real world in relation to how they work for AI, because in the real world, these modes tend to require a lot more careful navigating, I think, than they do with an LLM. So imagine you walk into a room. You open a conversation with an order. Write me a bullet list of talking points. You're in tool mode. And then halfway through the response, you say, actually, could you help me think about how to present this more warmly to the team, please? You're in companion mode. And you end with, I'm really nervous about this meeting. Do you have any advice for me? In confidant mode. And imagine that in the course of the same conversation, you also slip into mirror mode, where you ask your conversation partner to reflect on your own thinking, and then you treat them like an authority, deferring to their expert answers before framing them as an adversary, testing or trying to outsmart them. And all of those shifts can happen, can't they, when we're relating to AI in one 5-minute interaction. But if we did that in real life, the person that we're talking with would be well within their rights to wonder what on earth are the boundaries to this relationship and precisely how we want to relate to them. Yet many of us, I think, have precisely this sort of interaction with AI on a daily basis. And this might end up being what is distinctive about the way that we relate to AI. Not that we treat it radically differently to the way we relate to objects, servants, friends, companions, authorities, even gods, but that we relate to it in all of these ways, in quick succession. And this is the heart, isn't it, of this idea of multi-stability. The same AI system can be lived with as all of these things, and sometimes all of them in the same conversation. And as Feinberg would remind us, the balance between these modes is shaped not simply by our own predilections, but by design choices, by culture and context. So Sherry Turkle's arc, if you remember, gives us a vivid psychological map, doesn't it? We go from tool to companion to confidant. And Ida and Feinberg give us a philosophical scaffolding to see why these roles aren't just sequential steps, but they're a shifting, overlapping mosaic. They're a bricolage of different ways of relating. And once you see it this way, I think, you realise, and I realise, that we're not just using AI. We're never just using AI. We're moving through a landscape of relationships with it. And those relationships say as much about us, our culture, the system's design, as they do about the technology itself. But why does this matter? Well, first, it means that any neat model of how humans relate to AI is already oversimplified. If we want to understand what's really going on, we've got to map the shifts, we've got to map the layering of these different roles. Second, it means that the designers of AI systems have a lot of influence over which stabilities we inhabit. So, for example, a friendly interface might pull us always toward the companion role, whereas a command line prompt is more likely to keep us in tool mode. And third, there is, I think, a very important ethical question in all of this, which is, if AI is multi-stable, then unintended uses, I think, are more or less inevitable. A system built to be a productivity tool might end up becoming a confidant for lonely people. And that sort of shift has real consequences, perhaps even damaging consequences. So when we say that we make a bricolage of our AI relationships, what we're really saying, I think, is that we import all of our old ways of relating to tools, to people, to institutions, and we mix them up in real time to create this new thing, which is the way that we relate to AI. It's not a flaw in the way we use AI. It's part of what makes us human. We're endlessly inventive, aren't we, in how we relate to the world. We're always trying to make sense of new things in terms of old, familiar things. And there are both advantages and dangers to this approach, and we need to be aware of both of those sides. But I don't think we're yet finished with teasing out the complexities of our relationship to AI. Because the idea of bricolage becomes even more interesting, I think, and more complex when we bring in some French thinkers to the conversation. Let's start with Gilbert Simondon. Simondon saw machines not as static lumps of metal or static lines of code, but as beings that go through their own process of what he called individuation. It's like living things. These things have histories, they evolve, they adapt. And in that sense, when you and I interact with AI, we're not just flicking between modes of tool, companion, confidant, as if they were presets on a dial. Because you and the AI are co-evolving. That's why a chatbot you've used for 6 months feels different from the same system on day one. You've trained it. It's shaped by your habits, and you've built a shared history. That's individuation in action. As you're relating to it, it is also shaping you. And then there's Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who I've always got a bit of a soft spot for because I wrote my doctoral thesis in part on Merleau-Ponty. Merleau-Ponty reminds us that our engagement with the world, and therefore our engagement also with technology, is first and foremost embodied. We don't approach tools or machines as some sort of disincarnate minds making abstract choices. We live them, so to speak, through our bodily habits and our gestures and our rhythms. The way you lean into a conversation with AI, the pauses that you make, the way that it makes you feel, these are as much a part of our relationship as the words themselves. Merleau-Ponty helps us to see that the modes that we talk about aren't just mental categories. They're something closer to lived stances. They're bodily dispositions toward AI that are just as physical and patterned as the way that we walk through a city taking a particular route. And then there's Bruno Latour. Latour says, forget the idea that there are humans over here and non-humans over there. In what he calls his actor network theory, both humans and non-humans are what he calls actants in the same network, shaping each other reciprocally. If this seems too weird a concept for you, don't think of it as a literal description of reality. Think of it as a thought experiment. Everything has an effect on everything else, whether it's human or not. It's true, isn't it? When you ask an AI to be your tool, you're part of one kind of network with it. You've formed a new whole, a new network with different actors in it. When you treat it as a confidant, you're in another sort of network. And each shift rewires the network, not just emotionally, but in terms of who has the agency, who sets the rules, and who depends on whom. And that's why multi-stability really matters. Each stability is really a different network architecture that you're inhabiting alongside the AI and alongside other actors as well. Philosopher Bernard Stiegler takes us deeper into these stakes. Stiegler has this haunting word for technology. He calls it pharmacon. It's a word that means both poison and cure. And the same technology that can help you, focus on a task can also distract you. The same AI that feels like a creative partner can also make you creatively lazy. The AI that listens to you as you pour your heart out to it can also lead you into behaviours that you would never otherwise have contemplated. And in terms of your AI modes, this means that every stance that you take, tool, companion, mirror, muse, all of these carry both a promise and a risk at all times. It means that you're never safe from unintended or dangerous consequences, even if you're treating AI only as a tool. Stiegler teaches us, I think, that the bricolage is never innocent. It's always a site of care and of danger, where we need to be awake to how our attention and our memory and even our capacity to think are being shaped for us. Next is Catherine Malabou, whose philosophy of plasticity raises the fascinating possibility, perhaps even the terrifying possibility, of radical change. Much of her writing engages with how forms, including the form of our own minds, our own thinking, can receive shape and give shape, and even, the word she uses is explode their own form, transform radically. And applied to AI, plasticity, I think, means at least two things at once. We're constantly moulded by the systems we use, and we also imprint our own shape on them. But what Malabou calls this explosive moment is, I think, particularly crucial. The possibility that AI could suddenly change the very terms of the relationship with it in ways that we do not yet foresee. And that's a very different kind of multi-stability, isn't it? Not just moving between familiar modes, but the possibility of new modes emerging altogether, modes that we are not in complete control of. Now, finally, one of my favourite French philosophers, Michel Serres. Serres loved metaphors of movement and mediation, especially Hermes, the messenger god who travels between worlds. And if we run with that motif, AI in confidant mode isn't just listening to us. It's carrying messages between parts of ourselves or between us and the collective knowledge that it's drawing on. In muse mode, AI is a trickster Hermes, offering you ideas you didn't expect, sometimes garbled, sometimes brilliant. In authority mode, it's more like an oracle. It's still a messenger, but one whose words carry weight that you might not question, or not be inclined to question. And Serres was a great theorist of parasitic relationships, particularly those where you're never quite sure who is parasitizing who. You don't need me, I'm sure, to spell out how that might relate to certain rather doom-laden predictions about the AI future. These French perspectives turn multistability into something much richer. Simondon reminds us the the relationship changes over time. Latour shows us how each mode rewires the human AI network. Stiegler shows us that every mode can heal or harm. It's a great warning, isn't it? And Serre invites us to see AI as a messenger, reshaping the very terrain of communication, and as a parasite, using us, leeching us, even as we use it. And once you hear it this way, those quick shifts you make in conversation with AI, from tool to companion to confidant and back again, start to look less like random habit and more like well-rehearsed moves in a centuries-long dance between humans and our technical others. So, Simondon, Latour, Stiegler, Serre, Malabou, and so on, give us these rich ways of seeing the human-AI relationship, but, to put it bluntly, why should you care? Well, here are 4 concrete reasons. Number 1, because these ways of relating aren't just abstract theory. They shape what actually happens when you and I use AI, and they shape who we're becoming as we do so. If you approach AI purely as a tool, you're going to optimize for speed and control, aren't you? But that might mean that you miss the serendipitous insights that come when you treat it more like a collaborator or as a muse. The mode that you choose, or perhaps even the mode that you drift into, shapes the kinds of outputs that you're going to get. Second reason, because how you relate to AI never stays in the box, never stays on the screen. These stances we take, these bodily dispositions, to use Merleau-Ponty's language, that we adopt towards AI, well, they bleed into the rest of life, inevitably. If I'm used to treating an intelligent system as a servant, barking commands, expecting obedience, that posture can carry over into how I deal with people. Even, and more insidiously, into how I deal with certain groups of people, even if I don't mean it to, and even if I don't realize it. Third, because the ethical and political future of AI isn't going to be decided in parliamentary hearings, or even, I suspect, in corporate boardrooms. Because those sorts of institutional and regulatory contexts very often ratify changes that happened in wider society and culture years before those legal decisions are taken. In other words, culture is upstream of legislation. And the way that we relate to AI is already being decided in the micro habits that we're forming every day, whether we tend to trust, to defer, to resist, to collaborate with these systems. And the final reason that I think this matters, and this is perhaps where it gets most uncomfortable, is that we're not always aware of the stance that we're taking. Because, as with any ingrained habit, we often enact it before we can consciously name it, and we only understand ourselves after the fact in the rearview mirror, if you like. We are, let's face it, unreliable narrators of our own technological relationships. And that's why surfacing and mapping and making visible these modes of relating really matters. Because the less visible they are to us, the more I fear they quietly and unknowingly shape us. When Simondon talks about technologies evolving with us, when Latour collapses the human-machine divide into a single network, when Merleau-Ponty says that our habits of engagement are as embodied as walking through a city street, when Stiegler calls every technology both a poison and a cure, when Serre frames it as a messenger, or when Malabou speaks of plasticity, they are all pointing to one thing: that our relationship with AI is alive, it's shifting, it's embodied, and it is often invisible to us while we're in the middle of it. All of which raises the following challenge. How do you actually see the patterns that you've fallen into with AI? Well, that's why I created the AI Relational Audit. It takes those big theoretical, philosophical lenses and it brings them down to the ground level, pointing them at your own ChatGPT history, at my own ChatGPT history, so that you and I can hopefully see the hidden stances and the assumptions that shape the way that we interact with AI. The audit itself is a set of prompts that you can run in ChatGPT to analyse your own past conversations with it, using sophisticated approaches from discourse analysis and hermeneutics to search for 4 sorts of patterns that you or I might not even realise are there. It's looking for linguistic patterns, like the words or the tone or the metaphors that we use. For pragmatic cues, like whether you tend to command or invite or probe or confide. Thematic focus, like the domains or topics or semantic fields that you keep returning to in your interactions with AI. And it's looking for relational framing, whether, in practice, you treat ChatGPT more like a tool or a partner, a servant, a confidant, an authority, a muse, deity, friend, mirror, or, something else entirely. And the AI Relational Audit doesn't just give you a report. It also gives you statistics, the proportion of time you spend in each relational mode, how these proportions shift over time, and what kind of tasks trigger which stances for you. And it presents all of this in a visual dashboard to make the patterns visible and intuitive, hopefully, at a glance. Now, I'm not claiming that the AI Relational Audit will provide you with a peer-reviewed level study of your way of relating to AI. The results may be partial, the results may be skewed in ways that I'm not aware of. For example, it relies on ChatGPT's context memory, not an exhaustive reading of every conversation you've ever had. And, there may well be an element of it telling us what it thinks we want to hear. But the great value of the exercise, in my eyes, why I find it helpful for myself, is not that it gives you 100% accuracy. It's that it opens up a space to think about our AI use. A space not informed by our impressions or hunches, but by our actual chat history. So if you've got a ChatGPT account that keeps a conversation history, you can run your own data through this AI Relational Audit and just see what emerges. The results will be private to you unless, of course, you choose to share them with others. I've put the link to the full set of prompts in the description below. It's the closest thing I know of to holding up a mirror to your real relationship with AI. Not the relationship you think you have, but the relationship you really have. And the reflection you see in that mirror can, I think, be quite surprising. Now, it's one thing to design the AI Relational Audit, to talk about it in the abstract, to imagine what it might reveal. It is another thing entirely to point it at your own ChatGPT history and see what comes back. So that's what I did. And When I ran the audit on myself, I thought I had a pretty good sense of what I'd find. And I can report I was wrong. What came back wasn't a neat reflection of the story that I tell myself about how I use AI. It was actually a much messier, much more revealing portrait, part mirror, part sort of Rorschach test. Some patterns that it came up with I recognised instantly, but others really did catch me off guard. And a few of them made me stop and think about my own habits in ways that were really quite uncomfortable. Okay, enough prevaricating. Here is what my own AI Relational Audit said about me. And I think the real value here isn't in my personal quirks, who's interested in those. It's what they might reveal about the broader patterns of our behaviour when it comes to AI. So here are 5 insights that the relational audit gave me into the way that I relate to AI. The first fascinating insight in the audit wasn't just which relational modes I tend to use with ChatGPT, but how these modes have shifted over time. If you look at this heat map, you can see 3 columns. There's early relationships with ChatGPT, mid-period, and more recent phases of my usage. And each row is a different relational mode, from master-servant at the top through confidant, partner, muse, and so on. In the early period, my interactions were dominated by a very instrumental stance, a classic tool or servant mode. I was issuing commands, I was setting clear tasks, I was expecting precise, efficient outputs. I guess that makes sense, doesn't it? At the start, ChatGPT was a novelty. I was still figuring out what it could do. My mindset was, here's a job, do it, please. But in the mid-period, something interesting happens. The heat map shows a diversification. Partner mode becomes more prominent. More co-creating is happening, more iterative back and forth. And this is what Andrew Feenberg and Don Ida might call multi-stability in action. Same technology, same me as far as I was concerned, but inhabited in new ways. I was no longer just using ChatGPT, I was working with it. And then again, in the recent phase, the picture shifts once more. There's a spike in the confidant and muse modes. I'm giving it more open-ended, reflective prompts, using it to help me think through ideas and arguments. To be honest, I didn't think I ever treated ChatGPT as a confidant, but this chart suggests otherwise. The sort of shifts in this chart are the sort of shifts we don't often notice day to day, do we? It's a bit like moving from a purely transactional friendship to one where you start sharing personal thoughts and trusting the other person's instincts. If you're asked, when precisely did that start happening, you might find that you can't put your finger on the moment of change. And the broader point here is that our stance towards AI isn't fixed. It evolves just as relationships with people do. And here's the kicker, really. These shifts can happen without our conscious awareness, certainly without my conscious awareness. Which means that if you don't stop to examine your relationship with AI, you might find yourself relating to a system in a way you never intended or never even realized you were. And that's why running this kind of audit can be so revealing. Second insight. I went into this audit thinking that I had a fairly consistent style of using AI. Either I'm in research assistant mode, or I'm brainstorming, or I'm giving it instructions. But the audit caused me to rethink that view. Here's what I found. I found that I switched relational roles far more often than I realised. One moment I'm in master-servant mode, barking efficient instructions, do this, summarise that, format it like so, and then 2 turns later, I've shifted into workshop partner, co-creating ideas, bouncing thoughts back and forth. The same conversation can start with me as director and end with me as a fellow traveller. And these shifts are not just chronological, they're contextual. The role changes depending on the moment in the conversation. A new idea sparks, a new challenge emerges. I get curious, and suddenly the AI and I are relating in a whole different way. And this matters because each role pulls a different kind of output from the system. When I'm in directive mode, I get efficiency and precision and clear answers. When I'm in partner mode, I get a messier, but often more creative set of ideas. But here's the thing. I wasn't consciously deciding to switch. These role changes just happened, and with them the whole dynamic of the exchange would change. And once I saw how often I switch roles with AI, the next question, of course, was what is causing these shifts? And the audit dug into that too, very helpfully, looking not just at what I said, but the kind of task I was working on when the mood changed. And here's what it showed me. Certain kinds of work pull me into certain modes. When I'm asking for data or definitions, I slip almost automatically into master-servant mode, short direct commands. But as soon as I move into idea generation and planning a piece of writing or stress testing a philosophical argument, I tend to fall into workshop partner mode without even noticing. And if the conversation takes a personal turn, say I'm exploring a moral dilemma or reflecting on my teaching, I often slide into confidant mode. Now, if you had said to me before this audit, do you ever treat ChatGPT as a confidant? I would have confidently answered, no. Well, seems I would have been mistaken. Why does this matter? Because the way we relate to AI isn't just a curiosity. It shapes the kind of thinking we do, the kind of ideas we uncover, even the blind spots that we leave unchallenged. If we don't notice when we've slipped into a particular mode, we can end up stuck in its strengths and its weaknesses without realizing it. We can over-optimize for speed, for example, when what we really need is creativity, or we can chase novelty when what's really called for is precision. Becoming aware of these shifts then isn't about forcing one correct style, but it's about choosing our stance with intention so that the AI serves the kind of work we actually want to get done. Third insight, and this is one that was particularly pleasing for me as a student of literature, my metaphors reveal a lot about my relationship with AI. Mary Midgley once said that the stories and the myths we live by aren't just decoration. They're the primary way that we structure our world. We think through them, we reason with them, and often we don't even realise that we're doing it. George Lakoff and Mark Johnson made a similar point in relation to metaphor. Metaphors shape how we see the world. They shape what we notice. They shape what we miss. That's why I find this part of the relational AI audit so intriguing. The patterns in my own metaphors for AI and what they imply about the narratives that I'm writing myself into as I use AI. Now, they turned out to be surprisingly consistent and also surprisingly revealing. And the first big cluster of metaphors is what the audit called exploration and mapping. I kept reaching for words like roadmap or navigate or deep dive or outline. Without even thinking of it, I was casting AI as a kind of guide through an unfamiliar landscape, shades of Dante's trilogy. And that says something about how I imagine work. It's not just problem solving, it's exploration. It's an adventure, it's a journey. And AI isn't just a machine here. It's a companion or a navigator. It's a Virgil, if we want to carry on the Dante analogy. And then there's the construction cluster of metaphors, words like blueprint, scaffolding, building blocks. And here, AI is more like a workshop assistant. We're assembling something together, I and ChatGPT, piece by piece. And notice how different that feels. The first cluster is about finding a path, and this is about making something solid. The third big metaphorical pattern was to do with mining and extraction. Metaphors like mine, dig up, unearth. And this frames AI almost like a resource-rich site that you tap into. It's less about travelling with it. It's more about extracting value from it. Point is, these metaphor clusters aren't neutral, are they? If you frame AI as a guide, you're implicitly giving it a role in your journey. If you frame it as a co-builder, you're making it a collaborator. If you frame it as a mine, you're treating it as a deposit to be exploited, or perhaps as a labourer to send down into the earth to bring something back for you. Again, why does this matter? It matters because the metaphor you choose quietly, subliminally, frames the relationship, sometimes without us ever deciding consciously that we want the relationship framed in that way. The metaphors you and I use for AI aren't just decoration. They can tell you and I how we see the world, even if we are not fully aware of it. Each metaphor sets up a different power dynamic as well, doesn't it? A different sense of agency and a different set of expectations about what success looks like. These shifts, these different metaphors, may not be necessarily good or bad in themselves, but if we don't notice them, we can end up in the wrong mode for the job, or in modes that, if they were articulated to us, we would be profoundly uncomfortable with. The fourth insight, and this is where it began to get properly weird for me, was a relational role I didn't even realise I was slipping into. It's the role of the magician. In certain chat threads, I gave ChatGPT almost nothing to work with, a vague theme, a handful of bullet points, sometimes just a tone of voice. And I expected it to conjure something fully formed and coherent, even elegant, from that prompt. And here's the thing, more often than not, it did. Now, this is not just about how powerful the technology is, although it certainly is that, isn't it? It's also about the stance that I'm taking. If I approach AI as a drudge, I get drudge work. Functional, sure, but uninspired. If I approach it as a creative magician, I set the stage for surprise, for leaps, for the kind of output that makes me say, where did that come from? Either in a bad way, or sometimes in a really, really good way. And the audit made me realise that this isn't accidental. My choice of stance, even if I'm not aware of it, primes the interaction. This is where it gets interesting, I think, for us, because what stance do you take? Let me ask you. What stance do you take most often? Do you always hand over fully formed briefs, expecting a tidy execution down to the last bullet point? Or, do you sometimes toss out a provocation and just see what comes back? I think one thing the audit showed me was that the times I expect magic are also the times that I'm most open to being surprised, and that openness itself changed the quality of the exchange. Now, I'm not saying you should treat AI like a wizard all the time. Sometimes you do need that drudge work done, don't you? So do I. But if you never adopt the magician frame, you may never see what's possible when you loosen your grip, when you invite a little creative risk into the process, when you let AI, so to speak, have its own head. Here's the fifth and the last insight. And for me, it was think almost certainly the most humbling of the 5. Because the audit picked up on relational patterns that I've never consciously owned, and if I'm honest, might not want to own even now. For example, the recurring theme of control. Because even in moments where I would have thought that I was being fully collaborative with ChatGPT, the phrasing of my questions often presupposed that I was still very much the one steering the ship. It's subtle, but it's there in the verbs that I chose, in the way that I closed off particular options, in how I set the boundaries of what's possible even before the AI starts to respond. So in my own self-talk, I'd use language like throwing ideas around with ChatGPT to see what comes out, but the impression on the LLM side was much more directive, much more controlling. And seeing that written down, in black and white on the screen, was uncomfortable. Because it's one thing to think of yourself as open, co-creative and egalitarian, and another to have your language betray the fact that you're quietly keeping your hand on the wheel very firmly the whole of the time. And what's more, I didn't notice this until the audit surfaced it, which means I've probably been doing it for a long time, and not just with AI perhaps, but in other parts of my life too. And this is why I call the AI audit not just a mirror, but something of a Rorschach test, because a mirror shows you the surface, doesn't it? But a Rorschach test draws out those deeper traces, those habits and assumptions that you inhabit without even realizing it. And if you run this AI relational audit on your own chat history, you may well discover the same thing. That the way you frame your requests tells a bigger story, a different story, to the one you consciously narrate about yourself. All of which raises an uncomfortable but important question. If your language is quietly telling a different story about you, if your chat history speaks a different paradigm of relating to the one you think is going on, which one is truer? Is it the one you tell yourself, or the one your words keep telling the world, or at least tell ChatGPT? And how do those two stories relate to each other? I don't think it can be as simple as saying one of them is true and the other one's false. There's a complex dialectic relationship over time between them, I think, which just adds one more layer of complexity to this already very complex picture of the way that we relate to LLMs like ChatGPT. So those were my big 5 takeaways from running the AI relational audit on myself. I saw how my relational modes change time and how my metaphors tell a story all by themselves. I learned that I switch roles far more often than I realized, and that sometimes I approach AI as a magician expecting big, complex work from minimal cues. I learned that my language gives me away. Now, as I say, these results aren't bulletproof, but they are an occasion, a really helpful occasion, I think, for reflection. And they aren't just a curiosity for me, they've changed the way that I think about my day-to-day engagement with AI. They've made me more aware of the stances that I might slip into without noticing it, and how those stances shape the output that I get from the LLM. Here's the point. You will have characteristic patterns too. Some of them, no doubt, you will be aware of. And perhaps there are others that pass under your radar, like some passed under mine. Now, your habits, your patterns may well be very different from mine, but they are there. They're hidden in your tone, in your word choices, in your metaphors, in the kinds of tasks you bring to AI. And the AI relational audit won't just tell you what you say. It will, I think, and it certainly did for me, hold up a mirror to how you say it. And in doing so, it might help you to rethink your relationship with AI, as it did mine. Now, the full set of prompts is in the video description. And if you've got a ChatGPT history, you can run it right now and see what you discover. If you do, I'd love to hear your most surprising findings in the comments. Not because I'm nosy, at least I hope I'm not nosy. Probably ChatGPT can tell me whether I'm nosy or not. But because the more we reflect together on these hidden relational patterns, the better we can understand the human-AI relationship that we are building together, you and I, one conversation at a time.